This is not an ordinary heat wave. The air around you has not suddenly caught fire. A building has taken sunlight from the sky and aimed it directly at the street. You are standing in a zone of amplified radiation, feeling the exact phenomenon that architects usually measure only on a computer screen. A white patch of intense light crawls across the asphalt. When it reaches a metal door handle, the surface begins storing heat like an iron pan left over an open flame. Plastic elements on the street begin to soften. Tourists who came to explore the city are forced to retreat indoors, abandoning the pedestrian spaces that were supposed to be the heart of the urban experience. But the villain here is not the glass itself, at least, not glass alone. If we want to understand why modern cities are suddenly dealing with localized heat crises, we have to look past the dramatic headlines. We are looking at a fundamental flaw in how we measure the success of modern architecture. If a building prevents solar energy from entering its interior, where exactly does that energy go? The answer reveals a hidden cost that threatens the economic vitality of outdoor spaces worldwide. We have to start by looking at the promise that modern architecture sells to the world. The contemporary city is defined by its skyline, and that skyline is increasingly wrapped in continuous sheets of highly engineered glass. This material offers an irresistible combination of aesthetic brilliance and perceived efficiency. A smooth, reflective facade creates an illusion of weightlessness, mirroring the blue sky and dissolving the massive bulk of a skyscraper into the clouds. Inside these towers, the environment is perfectly controlled. Advanced glazing technologies block a significant portion of thermal radiation from penetrating the interior. The air conditioning systems run efficiently, the corporate occupants remain comfortable, and the building owners collect sustainability certificates to prove their commitment to a green future. These structures are marketed as modern, efficient, and deeply sustainable. But energy, as the laws of physics dictate, cannot simply be erased from existence. It cannot be magically destroyed by a clever architectural design. When a highly efficient glass facade rejects solar radiation to keep the inside cool, that radiation must go somewhere else. It either transmits, absorbs, or reflects. In the case of these super-reflective towers, massive amounts of thermal energy are being bounced back into the external environment. The building functions exactly as designed, acting as a massive shield for its occupants. Yet, in doing so, it effectively weaponizes the rejected sunlight against the surrounding environment. To understand how this happens, we must step away from architectural theory and look at basic optics. A building facade is no longer just a window separating the inside from the outside. In specific configurations, it becomes a gigantic optical device. If a building has a perfectly flat facade, it will reflect sunlight, and this might cause some uncomfortable glare for drivers or pedestrians. However, a flat surface reflects rays parallel to each other, meaning the energy remains relatively dispersed. If a building has a convex facade, meaning it curves outward, the reflected rays diverge and spread apart, safely dissipating the solar energy over a wide area. The danger emerges when architectural ambition introduces the concave facade. A concave surface curves inward, creating a geometric shape that fundamentally alters the behavior of light. A flat facade is like thousands of people throwing tennis balls in the same general direction. A concave facade is like all of those thousands of people aiming their throws at the exact same patch of ground. The reflected solar rays are forced to converge. They move closer and closer together until they intersect in a concentrated zone known as a caustic. In this zone, the radiation is amplified to unnatural levels. The building is no longer just a wall, it is a parabolic reflector operating in the middle of a densely populated city. This localized danger zone is incredibly deceptive because it does not stay in one place. The hotspot is entirely dependent on the movement of the sun across the sky. Its location and intensity are dictated by a complex equation involving the time of day, the day of the year, the exact curvature of the facade, the reflectivity of the glass, and the distance to the ground. Because the Earth rotates and orbits the sun, the angle of incoming solar radiation is constantly shifting. This means the dangerous focal point is always moving. It crawls across the city surface. It is silent, white, and almost invisible until something physical begins to react to the heat. On a Tuesday in November, the focal point might hover harmlessly in the empty air, above a busy intersection. But on a Thursday in July, at exactly 2 in the afternoon, that same focal point might touch down directly on an outdoor cafe seating area. The hotspot might trace a path across a row of parked vehicles, or it might slide up the side of a neighboring residential building. This moving phenomenon turns urban planning into a game of chance, where public spaces become temporarily hostile, depending on the astronomical calendar. The consequences of this optical geometry are not merely theoretical. They are documented in official planning records, most notably in the case of a specific skyscraper in London. The building located at 20 Fenchurch Street became a global case study in the unintended consequences of concave architecture. The structure featured a distinct top-heavy design with a concave southern facade wrapped in highly reflective glass. The architects aimed to maximize lucrative floor space at the top of the tower while maintaining a striking visual profile. They succeeded in their aesthetic goals, but the geometry created a massive solar convergence effect. During specific weeks of the year, sunlight hit the curved glass and was concentrated downward onto the narrow streets below. The results were shocking and meticulously documented by city authorities. Temperatures in the concentrated beam rose high enough to blister the paint on storefronts and singe the fabric of doormats. Most famously, the localized heat melted the plastic panels and mirrors of a luxury car parked on the street. The City of London had to intervene, recognizing that a single building was generating radiation levels that posed an active risk to the public realm. In response to this extreme event, the city eventually issued strict planning advice notes requiring deep assessments of solar convergence for future developments. London showed the world what happens when the computer models fail to account for the physics of the street. The engineers had to return to the site and install permanent sunshades across the facade to break up the reflective surface. A building designed to be a sleek glass monument ended up needing a giant visor to stop it from damaging the city that hosted it. While London demonstrated the property damage this phenomenon could cause, a different case in Las Vegas revealed the direct impact on the human body. The Vdara Hotel was designed with a beautiful, sweeping, concave glass facade that perfectly captured the desert sun. Unlike the crowded financial district of London, the area directly beneath this focal point was a luxury resort pool deck. This was a space specifically designed for human relaxation, a place where guests paid premium prices to escape the desert heat. Instead, they found themselves positioned directly in the path of a migrating solar beam. The curved glass acted like a magnifying glass, focusing intense solar radiation onto specific areas of the pool deck. Guests reported feeling sudden, intense burning sensations on their skin and hair. Plastic cups softened, and thick resort towels were scorched. The hotspot moved across the deck as the Earth rotated, meaning the danger zone shifted predictably but inexorably throughout the afternoon. The resort management attempted to mitigate the issue by installing large umbrellas, but the fundamental flaw was built into the glass geometry itself. The irony is stark and difficult to ignore. A luxury property designed to provide the ultimate comfort experience ended up creating an environment that was physically hostile to its own guests. The Las Vegas incident shifted the conversation from melting plastic to human safety, proving that architectural oversight can directly harm the people it is supposed to serve. However, the spectacular accidents of melting cars and scorching pool decks may be distracting us from something much larger and more insidious. A facade does not need to achieve the extreme focal intensity required to melt plastic to fundamentally damage a city. The true crisis is not always a sudden fire. It is the quiet, daily erosion of the urban microclimate. When highly reflective buildings bounce broad sheets of sunlight down to the street level, they raise the mean radiant temperature for anyone walking outside. This has profound implications for a city heavily invested in its tourism and retail sectors. If a famous shopping avenue becomes 10 degrees hotter because of the reflections from a new tower, tourists will stop walking there. They will seek shelter, cut their trips short, or stay inside air-conditioned malls. Outdoor cafes lose their afternoon customers because the glare and heat make sitting outside unbearable. Retailers on the ground floor suffer quiet economic losses as pedestrian foot traffic evaporates in the blinding light. This creates a subtle tourism crisis. A destination might market itself as a vibrant, walkable metropolis, but the architectural reality forces people out of the public square. The extreme events generate the viral headlines, but the repeated, low-level radiation quietly destroys the economic and social function of the street. This brings us to a critical question of equity and urban design. Who is actually standing outside when the heat is reflected downward? The people inside the glass tower look out through tinted, low-emissivity glass and see a beautifully filtered blue sky. They operate in a climate-controlled bubble, insulated from the consequences of the building envelope. The people below experience a completely different reality. They see a blinding white glare that forces them to look away. The victims of this architectural oversight are the delivery drivers waiting for orders on the hot pavement. They are the security guards stationed outside hotel entrances for hours at a time. They are the tourists trying to navigate a new city, quickly becoming exhausted by the amplified heat. They are the residents of older, less insulated buildings across the street, who suddenly find their apartments baking because a new glass tower is reflecting the afternoon sun directly through their windows. The benefits of the high-performance facade are privatized, kept strictly inside the boundaries of the wealthy corporation or the luxury tenant. Meanwhile, the external costs, the thermal load, the visual glare, and the physical discomfort are socialized. They are pushed out into the public domain for everyone else to deal with. At this point in the investigation, we must confront evidence that appears to contradict our central thesis. If glass buildings are entirely to blame, then every modern city with a glass skyline should be unlivable. But urban climate research provides a much more nuanced picture. Studies conducted on urban heat islands in extreme climates, such as those found in the Middle East, indicate that advanced low-emissivity glass is not the sole cause of urban warming. In many cases, the use of proper insulated glass actually prevents heat from being trapped inside structures, lowering the overall cooling demand and reducing the amount of hot air pumped out by air conditioning units. Does this counter-evidence destroy our investigation? Absolutely not. It actually makes our understanding much more precise. The equation is not simply that glass equals heat. The true equation is that high reflectivity, combined with concave geometry, combined with specific solar angles, combined with human activity in the receiver zone, creates the microclimate risk. The problem is not the material itself. The problem is the careless application of the material without regard for the three-dimensional space it interacts with. This scientific nuance forces us to look away from the glass manufacturers and turn our attention to the real culprit. The true villain of this story is the dark side of the corporate sustainability matrix. We have developed an incredibly sophisticated system for measuring building efficiency, but that system is tragically nearsighted. When developers apply for green building certifications, they provide massive spreadsheets detailing how little energy their building consumes. They prove that their coated glass reduces the internal cooling load by 20%. They celebrate the reduction in their carbon footprint. But energy rejected by the facade does not vanish. The spreadsheet is broken because its boundary of responsibility stops at the exterior wall of the building. The certification process rarely asks what happens to the energy after it bounces off the glass. It does not measure the increased thermal load on the sidewalk. It does not simulate the glare hitting a taxi driver. It does not calculate the extra air conditioning costs forced upon the older building next door. A building can produce a perfect score in the environmental report, as long as the report never asks how the person standing outside feels. This is not true sustainability. It is optimization by exclusion. The architecture industry has successfully redefined environmental efficiency to mean nothing more than internal corporate savings, completely ignoring the externalized microclimate damage. The frustration is that this is an entirely preventable problem. The engineering solutions exist and are well understood by the industry. Before a single piece of steel is laid, architects can run advanced ray tracing simulations to map exactly where the reflections will land on every day of the year. They can alter the geometry, breaking up large concave sweeps into flat, angled facets that diffuse the light. They can specify glass with lower specular reflectivity and higher diffuse reflectivity, meaning the light scatters rather than bouncing like a laser beam. They can design the building so that any unavoidable focal points occur harmlessly in the empty sky, far above pedestrian zones. If a building is already constructed and causing harm, the solutions are much more painful and expensive. Owners must install external fins, louvers, or shading screens to interrupt the reflective surface. They have to physically block the architecture they spent millions of dollars designing. The irony is profound. A structure engineered to proudly display a smooth, seamless glass skin must eventually be wrapped in metal blinds to protect the surrounding city from its own reflection. The tools to prevent this exist, but they require a shift in priorities from pure aesthetics to contextual responsibility. But this architectural phenomenon reveals a much deeper economic vulnerability hiding behind the polished skyline. When a city renders its own streets unlivable through reflected solar radiation, it forces a massive behavioral shift. The entire tourism ecosystem is pushed indoors, transforming the city from a connected urban experience into a series of isolated, air-conditioned islands. This creates an invisible but colossal financial burden. To maintain these internal sanctuaries, the cooling systems must work continuously against the very heat their own building envelopes are rejecting. This is the ultimate architectural paradox. The towers are essentially caught in a localized arms race against one another, pumping out exhaust heat that further degrades the ambient street temperature. The energy required to sustain this loop is staggering. In a desert environment, that energy heavily relies on fossil fuels and massive desalination plants just to provide the water necessary for cooling towers. As global environmental pressures mount, the cost of simply keeping the city habitable begins to eat into the profitability of the broader economy. This is where the localized heat crisis bleeds into retail weakness and real estate oversupply. Ground-floor commercial spaces lose their value when foot traffic evaporates into the glaring heat. If the destination becomes known merely as an expensive indoor transit lounge, the aviation model linking millions of global tourists to this specific location faces a sudden existential risk. Investors and developers are realizing that the glossy brochures left out the true maintenance cost of this urban model. A city cannot sustain infinite growth if every new iconic structure makes the ground level increasingly hostile to human life. The pressure is no longer just meteorological, it is fundamentally economic. The long-term survival of this real estate and tourism engine depends entirely on whether it can adapt its design philosophy before the operational costs become unbearable. The architectural hubris that defined the last 2 decades of expansion is now meeting the hard limits of thermodynamics and municipal budgets. The bill for ignoring the public realm is finally coming due. When we expand our view from a single problematic building to an entire modern metropolis, the scale of the threat multiplies. Imagine a city like Dubai, acting as a grand urban laboratory in one of the most intense solar environments on Earth. Here, the climate is naturally challenging, and the architectural ambition is legendary. When dozens or hundreds of highly reflective towers are built in close proximity, they stop acting as individual buildings. They begin to function together as a massive, complex optical system. Sunlight bounces off one facade, travels across a street, and strikes another facade. The heat is trapped in the urban canyon, repeatedly absorbed and re-radiated by the concrete and glass. The natural ventilation is blocked, and the ambient temperature climbs. A reflective solution that saves money for one tower directly increases the thermal load for its neighbor. In a city where the tourism economy relies heavily on creating a comfortable, luxurious experience, this microclimate degradation is a serious systemic risk. A beautiful skyline is economically useless if the streets below it are too hostile to walk. The facade of a building is not an entirely private element. Because it interacts with the sun and the wind, it is an active participant in the public climate. The towers that scorch the pavement do not break the laws of physics. They follow them with terrifying perfection. That is precisely the problem. We have reached an era where human beings possess the engineering capacity to wrap a desert city in endless sheets of glass. We have the technology to bend the skyline into almost any shape imaginable, defying gravity and tradition. But regardless of how much capital is spent or how advanced the software becomes, every surface built on this planet must still answer an ancient, fundamental question. When the sunlight reaches it, where does the energy go? For decades, the architectural rendering has asked us to look up, to admire the sheer scale and the seamless reflection of the clouds. But the true cost of our modern architectural ambition is not found in the clouds. It is found on the ground. The evidence asks us to look down at the street, at the changing microclimate, and at the spaces we are slowly making uninhabitable. The illusion of the perfect glass tower is starting to fade, not because the glass is failing, but because the city around it can no longer absorb the heat. This video is an independent analysis based on public architectural data, physics principles, and documented urban planning case studies at the time of research. The specific impact of any glass facade depends on unique local variables, including geometry, solar angles, and urban density. This content examines systemic design trends and does not intend to target or defame any specific city, individual, or business. It is not intended as professional engineering, financial, or travel advice. Urban microclimates are complex systems, and viewers should consult official meteorological and planning resources for specific local conditions. If you value documentaries that look beyond the marketing brochures and examine the real forces shaping our modern cities, please subscribe to the channel. The most important warning signs are rarely found where the developers tell you to look.